existed, and that the Hebrews actually were there. At the time, the whole area, including Canaan, the nations up north and down south of where they came out of Egypt, were terrified of them, of their God. They had heard about what happened in Egypt. This was not, the king didn't look out at these people and go, oh, another rowdy bunch of people coming through. He was frightened, and he didn't want them as his neighbors, okay, because they would be on the other side of the Jordan. He didn't want that. So he hired a diviner from the northern area. They said far east, but when I look at a map, I go north, slightly east. Balak offers a large sum of money if, and it was conditional money, if he would curse the Israelites, okay, and get them out of the area. Just curse them so that they would all die off and go away. And he wouldn't have to deal with them. On 4 occasions, Balaam stands next to King Balak, the king, and attempts to curse Israel. But he told Balak before he began, I can only speak what God tells me to speak. And he was ready with his curse, and all that would come out of his mouth were blessings. He couldn't curse Israel. And every blessing was greater in grandeur than the last one. I was probably killing King Balak. He was probably gotta be kidding me. Thank goodness, if he doesn't curse, at least I don't have to pay him. Because that's what I paid him. I'm gonna pay him for. Each time they got better, but then, after they'd been blessed and the king could not destroy them, the women of Moab and Midian invited the young men of Israel to their sacrificial feasts. A little hospitality is great, right? But it's local idol worship and a Baal of Peor. You've heard that probably back in your readings. It introduced to the Israelites, again, sexual attraction, feasts, and idolatry to induce Israel's rebellion to their God, Yahweh, whom they feared. They wanted to get rid of this people, okay? When idolatry entered through that portal, God's wrath fell on the Israelites immediately. There was a plague, and 24,000 people died. Jeez. Before Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, stopped it through his prayers to God. Later, when Israel defeats Midian in battle, Moses tells us why this plague came. And it said, when the curses through Balaam did not bring about Balak's desire to defeat Israel, he hired the temptresses to go in and defeat through subtlety to get the Israelites to curse themselves. And that's what happened. I mean, here they were protected by these blessings, by this diviner who could only speak the words of God. They were blessed mightily, but then the temptresses destroyed them from within. So now the battles are over on the plains, and Israel prepares to enter the promised land. A census is made from the second generation. Remember that the first generation after the Exodus died in the wilderness, except for Joshua and Caleb. Who were they? Remember they sent 12 spies into the land way down south by Kadesh? They went in and spied out the land. There were 2 who came back with a positive thought. And 10 came back telling them there were giants in the land. I mean, they did have milk and honey. Everybody saw the fruit, the huge fruit that came out of the country, but they couldn't wipe off the idea that there were giants in the land. They would be killed. Except Joshua and Caleb, they didn't even notice the giants. They were more interested in It's a land of milk and honey. It's beautiful land, fertile. We're going to have a great life. So they're the only ones who actually survived out of that second generation. Now, they were younger already. They were young men at the time that they were sent in to spy out the land. Moses appointed Joshua in the plains of Midian to be his successor, because God said that Moses would have to die. So Moses is going to die on the east side of the Jordan. They say he got taken up to a mountain and was shown the land of Canaan, but he wasn't allowed to enter it. He would die there. At that same time as they prepared to go into the new land, new laws and regulations were given for a period of time, and a new covenant renewal ceremony on the plains of Moab transferred power from Moses to Joshua. And Joshua ushered them across the Jordan. Deuteronomy confirms Israel's oath to obey all God's commandments, statutes, and judgments so they may live long in the land. That was the whole purpose, so that they may live long in the land. In the Hebrew historical explanations of this period, I don't mean Christian, I mean Hebrew studies, one of the maps that I have there shows the 4 legs of the journey that they have labeled from Sinai finally to the plains of Moab at the edge of the Jordan. And you can see those 4 legs of the journey. I was going to do some studies on it, and but I had a Lions convention in Hope, Arkansas this weekend, and so I've spent my weekend in after the tornado in Hope. Everybody down there was very concerned about us. They really were. And as I drove through today, I remember trying to drive back to the village. It took Gotti and I over an hour and a half to get home. Wow. From where the tornado hit out on 7. I counted from that point, trying to find a way through, because when I got there, the police weren't yet there, and the debris was horrible, and we saw the twisted buildings over on the side. I stopped because there were boards and everything all over the road. And a fire truck out of the fire station down by the nursing home down Highway 7 came around and parked in front of me sideways across the road and said, "You're not going any further." He said cars are turned over and people are injured. And so we were just minutes after it occurred. Wow. So we tried the Lazy Po gate, electricity was off, gate didn't open. So we drove all the way around to the Balboa gate, and I didn't do Danville because I figured that's another 1.5 miles in, and if it's closed, 1.5 miles back out. So Balboa was open. We came through. I thought, I'm not going to Balearic. I'm going to go straight to DeSoto, because DeSoto will be open. So I went out to DeSoto and it was closed. Got taken off back to, the area of Broda, and go to Pamplona, come down to Menorca, and you head down. Closed. Can't go through. No, because when I got around Balearic, came up over the Pineda Dam thing, and came up over that hill, power line, right across the road. Policemen and emergency there. No, can't come through here. So we went back out, had to go back through the Lazy Po gate now was manually opened. So we went out Lazy Po, came back in, up Mazaron. Tried to turn left. No, not going through. We saw a car just destroyed. Right beside the road. We saw trees just as you've seen them today, just flat down. And so we turned around, went down towards where we had been blocked on Balearic at Camino, where Camino comes out to Balearic. Closed. I'm sorry, you can't come through here. There's no way through. Boy, what happened? I can't go to the front gate, I can't go to the back gate because DeSoto's closed. Finally, he said, well, about an hour's passed. I'm sure that Highway 7's open. Why don't you just go on back to Highway 7 and go through the west gate?
My God.
We succeeded. That has nothing to do with today's.
And it was dark, right?
Yeah, it was pitch
It
dark.
was dark. Exactly.
Yeah, power was out, yeah.
Wow. We missed all that.
What was really scary were people were stopping there, people that lived in the townhouses by the community center, they just got out of the cars and walked home. There was no way home. If they didn't walk, they wouldn't get there.
Wow.
So, and they weren't even wanting them to do that because the power lines were down.
Right.
Yeah, so, I don't know what they did eventually. Okay, we are, as you can see, through the plains of Moab, through Edom, Moab. Now they're sitting at the edge of the Jordan, and they are asked to go in and conquer Canaan. And this is another area of obedience, but it's first righteousness. Holiness was the first thing. Didn't matter how good they were at battle. It mattered how righteous they were, how much they obeyed the Lord, how much they believed what he asked. But, so, excuse me, not but, the Hebrews needed to be ritually pure. The first thing they did was circumcise themselves so that they could, it was specifically mentioned, to worship, in order to worship. If they couldn't worship God, then he would not be with them in battle, okay? In order to worship God, they had to be ceremonially pure, and there were a lot of little rules and regulations you would have read throughout this. It says, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And just like at the Red Sea, Israel passed over the dry land of the river Jordan. 12 stones were removed from the middle of the river and set up on the west side of the Jordan as a memorial that they'd walked again across a river on dry land. Over 1 million people crossed over. It was huge. Just, you can't imagine. Over 1 million people are crossing this river. Yes?
I think it was as narrow there as it was where we visited in the Holy Land. It wasn't it? I mean, we're not talking about
I believe it was much wider.
Oh, much wider.
Much wider.
Okay.
Because it was more toward the head of the stream and in a major area for Jericho to use it as a water source.
Okay.
Now they removed those stones and set it up on the 10th day of the first month, and all of us go, well, their calendar's different from ours, but on the 10th day of the first month, a powerful remembrance day was celebrated. On the 14th, the first Passover was celebrated since they left Kadesh. And after that, the manna stopped. As they entered Jordan, there was no manna that fell. They were to eat from the land. So if they conquered, they got food. And if they didn't conquer, they went hungry. Possibly overlooked, we should pay attention to Joshua's walk. He took a walk as they were standing there, and he encountered an angel. But we know this angel was God because he allowed him to do what? Bow down before him. Angels would not permit you to do that. So we know that this was God. And it turns out that he was, and he carried a sword, and he required that Joshua take off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. Sound like something familiar? Who was the other one? Moses at the burning bush, right? Only the author tells us there was no geographical area of holy ground like at the bush. It included the whole of Canaan. This was now holy ground. So they would have to walk righteously, circumspectly, and obediently through the land of Canaan. Didn't take long before that didn't happen. Okay. The preparations to go with the sacredness of the land and prepare them for a holy war. It is called harem, referring to devoting to destruction. This requires completed destruction of the thing. Only within the land of Israel did the Israelites do Haram war. What did Haram war show, according to this author?
Well, you got to kill everything.
That is Haram. You devote to destruction all life, okay? And everything. Yeah, they weren't even take, what do you call it?
Money?
Anything out
Right.
to keep, okay? Hide it in their tents. Why did God ask this? This is a hard one for us Christians to understand why he would ask them to destroy absolutely every living thing. Why?
You needed to start over.
Purify it?
Purify it. Exactly. That's what it was. Remember, he didn't let them go in at first, the 40 years back, because it wasn't time. They hadn't gotten evil enough. There was a certain level of evil that God was awaiting. He knew they would, but it wasn't time. So he didn't bring Israel in until he felt that their wickedness was horrible. The battle begins at Jericho. You know the story. They marched around Jericho for 7 days and it fell. And once Achan's rebellion is punished, Ai also crumbled. What they did was they went from Jericho straight to Ai in this great battle fervor. They were ready to just take Ai, and they lost the first battle. What happened? What did Achan, an Israelite, do? He stole some of the stuff out of Jericho and hid it in his tent. And that's not going to be allowed. They're not going to be able to take the idols, the golden idols, hid him under some stuff in his tent, and he was found out. So it's sort of like any other sin. If you hide it, it's not hidden from God. He knows. And if you think your life is kind of going downhill, you might look at, what am I doing in my life that maybe I shouldn't be doing? Come back to your righteousness. Come back to holiness. Come back to believing that God is true and righteous. Okay? One would think at this point, in Joshua 11, in your Bible, if you're looking through the Bible, they had conquered everything, because it just stated clearly that all was done and Joshua died. But in Joshua hadn't died. But at this point, I'm going to see if I have it in the next slide. No, I don't. The hinge between Joshua and Judges is what? The story that connects the end of Judges with the beginning of Joshua. What hinges the two books?
His death. A hinge
His
repeats
death.
the same events at the conclusion of one book as with the next.
It was Joshua's death, okay? And it all looks to see, all of it now goes to look to see if, at the end of Joshua's life, God said, well, you haven't conquered all, we need to finish it. So he took the elders of Israel and asked them to go on into the land, now go on in through the rest of the land and conquer it as God had asked. He didn't pass on leadership to anybody. He just asked the elders to do this, like a committee. You know how committees work. What's he looking for? There was a charge he made, a threefold charge. What were the three things that God asked them to do when they were conquering the land? Haram?
Not let them live or be their neighbors.
That's right. Third one? Don't marry, don't mingle, or get into their worship, okay, of other gods. So the answer to whether they can obey is found immediately in Judges.
Hey, Sammy, before we go to the judges, could I just read one paragraph in here?
Absolutely.
That sums up this concept, I don't know if it sums it up, but
Uh-huh.
it helps clarify that concept of harem
Mhm.
that, as you mentioned, is troubling, but it's clearly
Necessary.
biblical. And it goes back to that word I use all the time, keeping in mind the eschatological nature of Christian revelation, that we're always looking at the historical now
Mhm.
and the final
Mhm.
end of all things. Those two tensions are always there. So on page 62 in your book, let me read that last paragraph if I could, at the bottom, because I think he sums it up nicely. Is everybody there? What role did this harem warfare, which seems terribly cruel for us moderns, play? First, it has a purifying function. The land lay defiled under the abomination of the Canaanites, so they had to be vomited out by death. Leviticus 18. The status of the land as holy demanded that and God said it was holy. You know, just like the ground at the bush, God said this is holy ground. He declares this to be holy because it was his will for it to be holy. The status of the land as holy demanded that the wicked Canaanites and their idolatry be purged by devoting them to destruction. Secondly, this devastation foreshadowed the final judgment of what all sinners deserve before the holiness of Yahweh. We should not think that this harem was easy for Israel. In fact, they failed to complete this order from God. Rather, the horrors of harem displayed the true wages of sin for all sinners, and it exhibits the full justice of Yahweh against sin and evil. This is why harem warfare was only commanded of Israel for a limited time, and only within the borders of the Promised Land. The presence of harem in the Old Testament does not give Christians the right to endorse the use of something like it today. That's an important
Very important, thank you.
conclusion. So
Thank
that's
you.
a good summary. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, now Judges is, as you know, a cycle, and you get tired of reading the stories because it's a cycle, okay? It's repeated over and over again, and everybody goes, hum, hum, hum. I'm so tired of listening to this. But as the author explains to us, there are 5 points. Israel does evil by going after other gods. Secondly, in the cycle, Yahweh gives them over to their enemies. Thirdly, Israel cries out for mercy. Fourth, God raises up a judge who delivers them. And fifthly, the land has rest. A year, 40 years, 80 years. But there's one thing the author wanted us to understand. We think of it as sequential. This judge followed this judge, followed that judge. No, it isn't what happened. This judge was over in this tribe. Another judge that's mentioned was over in another tribe. The judgments were in different geographical areas of the land, and it was not sequential. So this judge might have overlapped this judge, and so you can't add them up and say this many years passed. Okay, so understand that's very important. It was not, you can't total them all up and say this was how many years the judge's cycle occurred. It occurred in different areas at different times. It's not only a two-dimensional spiral, he also mentions, as they go through these cycles. It's not just they went after other gods and God delivered them. And it was the same level of disobedience each time. Now, it was worse. Every time he had to send a judge, the spiral was already, disobedience was already less. So the people were worse and worse. They were going after the idols of the country. They were intermarrying. They were They really didn't look like the Israelites that started out on the other side of the Jordan. They were beginning to look a lot like their enemies. What was Israel's prime failure according to the author?
He didn't follow God's laws.
No, that was part of it, but there was a big one, bigger than that.
Didn't do heroin.
Exactly. They didn't do heroin. They let people live, they kept the idols, they worshiped the idols. You remember one judge toward the end actually strolled by the idols, just walked by. Didn't do anything to them. And that shows you where they were. Okay, we don't want to worship them, but we'll just leave them. And that's the problem. If you leave them, the temptation is standing there right beside the road to go up on the hills and worship.
That's what we're doing today.
Exactly. Judges 3, 5 and 6 says, so the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites. And their daughters took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. Secondly, God used this cycle to see if they would obey and whether they could. He was hoping they would learn. You know, he just went through this. Finally, this series of cycles deals with leadership. Joshua did not appoint a successor. There was no one in charge. What does a group of people do without a leader? We saw it in our Western history. What did they do? Well, they just hung people. They didn't have trials. They didn't have, or they made themselves judges.
Yeah, so why didn't Joshua appoint a successor?
We don't know.
There's
We're not
nothing,
told.
nothing in there.
We're not told. He just,
But isn't that strange?
it is strange. It is strange. All I can figure it was according to God's plan. The whole thing, because the rest of the history of Israel goes around the idea of this lack of leadership. We'll get that in just a couple of seconds. If it deals with leadership, Joshua and his elders had died, okay? Joshua hadn't appointed a successor, and each judge that was brought up after that was measured by 4 things. First one was their devotion to God. Second was their marriage and the treatment of women. Interesting, isn't it? And their treatment of women. Thirdly, their military conduct. And fourthly, the religious reforms they enact to help the people obey, if they enacted any. First, we see Othniel, and like I said, I'm not going through all these judges, okay? But we see Othniel come out first. Who was his older brother? Caleb, yes. So he comes from a righteous family, and obviously they see things according to the way God sees things, and they see things in righteousness, obedience, faithfulness. But Ehud after him, and remember these are not sequential. These occurred at different times, overlapping. Ehud briefly takes up the call of God and succeeds in war, but falls short on piety. He's the one who strolled past the idols. That was the second judge mentioned. So you can imagine they're already spiraling down. The first one, Caleb, succeeded and was faithful to God. The second one, where he wasn't faithful at all. So it was not like they got better at the end of a cycle of a judge and they dropped again. It wasn't this. It was this, this, this. Every spiral went further down. It ended with, which judge? What was the last judge? Samson. You remember? Samson. And after him came one that was not called a judge. He was a Levite, who had a concubine,
He didn't have a wife.
didn't have a wife, is mentioned in the Bible. He travels though to an area that's more wicked than Sodom and Gomorrah and sounds a whole lot like the story of Lot. They attack him and he tosses his concubine to them, and they abuse her, rape her, and kill her. What does he do?
He takes her home, cuts her up, and
Cuts
sends
her
her
pieces.
And how many?
12.
Well,
And sends them to
the different tribes.
the 12 tribes of Israel. You want to start war?
Wait, Sami Jo,
That's a good way,
who was
yes.
that? Who did that? Who
We
was
don't
that?
have his name. He was a Levite, that's what we
He's not
know.
Levi, okay.
He cut her into a dozen pieces, set her, and it outraged the tribes. 400,000 men stood up and said, "This is wrong."
Well, thank
know?
you.
What did they do? This last Levite was in the land of the Benjaminites. What did they do?
Well, they killed all the Benjaminites.
Yeah. They committed harem against the Benjaminites,
Against
their own people. But they didn't do it to the nations in Canaan. And when they found that there was only one town left that they needed to go do this to, they realized there would be no descendants of Benjamin, so what did they do?
He saves the virgins.
Yes, they saved 400 virgins out of the last town. Killed everybody else. Wiped out all of Benjamin's descendants. And the last sentence sums up their disobedience. And you all know it, you've seen it, you've heard it. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own sight. You hear this again and again, and if you're not careful, you'll hear it coming out of your own mouth. Well, that's what I think is right. Well, that's what I think I should do. Well, that's what, well, but what about the Bible? What does the Bible say? Have you looked? Have you looked to see what He requires of you that day? It's an interesting thought. Don't think you're beyond these Israelites. They were as human as you and I. They weren't different. Don't think they were more wicked than any other human being. They were typical human beings. In fact, they had a notch above in knowledge. They saw the wonders of God. They saw the plagues of Egypt. They lived through these things. Their parents lived through these things. They were there. As we end this chapter, it's pretty much the whole of the cycle finished. Again, I tell you, don't add up the years and try to think that you'll figure out how long they were in these cycles. But we have some questions I'd like to ask. Well, we went over Herod. You all seem to have that down pretty good. One of his questions in the back, what was God's purpose in doing the cycle of the judges, do you think? It's just an opinion. It doesn't have to be a biblical statement. But what do you think he was doing it?
He was testing the Israelites
Mm-hmm.
and wanted to see if they would follow him, turn back to him.
Yes.
They didn't. I've been reading, I get Hillsdale College,
Mm-hmm.
they have courses,
Mhm.
and they have one on David,
Mm-hmm.
one on Genesis,
Mhm.
and I just read the one on the Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
And he was explaining the difference between Hebrew and Israelite, and when it's used.
Mm-hmm.
When he talks about Hebrews, that's looking into
The people.
when God talks about the Israelites, they're his people.
Mm.
It's
Interesting. That's a good thought. Yeah.
it's a very, interesting little series,
Yes.
and it's free, if anybody, you get a different, he's not espousing any particular Christian or Jewish, he's just explaining, and
Mhm.
it makes you think, you know, cause I've always wondered, why do we have all these same names for the different
For the
names for the
Israelites,
same
yeah.
people?
I use the Hebrews more in the biblical, Old Testament sense. They're not necessarily called Hebrews, so much in the New Testament. But the questions that I wondered was, why did the judges get progressively worse, do you think?
They didn't have a leader.
Well,
They didn't, they were
they didn't
made a
have-
leader
They
suddenly.
didn't have righteous leaders.
They weren't righteous.
Who
As-
chose them?
Uh-huh.
Who chose the judges as, when they were appointed, I mean, who appointed them?
God.
God did.
Uh-huh,
Okay,
God.
that's what I thought.
God appeared to each of them and called them. You remember, who was it? He argued against God. He said, I can't do this. I'm just a young kid. You know, what are you asking me to do? They argued with God over this. So yeah, it was a direct call, and they knew it. Has anybody in here been called directly? Not me. But it's interesting as you go through this, if you'll just wipe out from your thoughts, well, these people were more wicked than we are today.
Hard to imagine, yeah.
No, they were less obedient because, well, the answer is because they lived on the other side of Jesus Christ. Okay? They
And
had
also-
no idea what was really coming.
And also, they had that 400 years as history of being in Egypt. They had lost. They had a few memories.
But the generation that died in the wilderness had that.
But
The
still,
ones that
still
survived.
had some of it. And then you
It's
had
like we
people-
have memories from our parents. And this is how it was explained to me by a theologian in Switzerland, is that my generation had inherited Christianity from my parents, who had inherited their Christianity from their parents on down through the time. And when my parents were Christians, seminaries were not teaching the full Bible, and they were doubting the veracity of Christ. They were doubting the veracity of miracles. They put a lot of doubt into the pastors who left, and many pastors walked out of seminary as non-believers. And they went to the churches and they go, well, I don't have Christ now as what I'm going to teach on, so what did they bring into the churches? And we grew up with this. Social programs. Well, let's get people to do good things for other people. Let's make it a social club. And the churches began to look more like social clubs, and instead of churches. Worship was pushed down, and because there wasn't a belief in this holy God that had occurred in generations before. And as it was with the judges, this spiral had occurred over centuries. It was not just one day.
Exactly, it's, what happens today, generationally, is exactly what was happening back in that day.
I was a young
Hardly
person.
you get away.
I was a young person at that time, and he was saying that our kids would inherit what? If most of my generation wasn't going to church anymore, what would they inherit? What would they know about the Bible? It wasn't even mentioned. And that's what's occurred. And each generation puts out another group of people further and further away from the Christianity of the nation, as when a lot of Christians came over.
When I was I didn't go to Catholic school that long, but
Mhm.
enough, more than enough. But they weren't really teaching the Bible. They were
Mhm.
we were learning rules and regulations. And that was one of my big concerns. My grandsons have been, they're not Catholic, but they were in Catholic schools from first grade through high school.
Mhm.
And they actually have textbooks, and they study the Bible now, which I thought was really interesting.
Good.
And I see a big difference in the children coming out of the Catholic schools, at least down in Lafayette.
Right.
That's such a small percentage of the children, though.
Well, yeah, and you have to have a lot of money to go to Catholic school now. I mean, I think
It's
it's
not
like,
free, yeah.
when I went, it was $10 a month or something like that.
I remember my poor dear brother, who was 2.5 years younger, had some learning disabilities, and they figured if they put him in the Catholic school, they could at least handle it better. I don't know if that helped or not.
Well, we had a very small Catholic grammar school, there were 2 grades, 6 classes, with 1 teacher. And there was one boy who had learning disabilities, his name was Hackamarone, and he sat in the back by himself. And the teacher would work, I'm gonna say, but she had like 3rd and 4th grade, and she would work with one, and the other side had paperwork to do. And then she would switch, and then she'd give all the children busy work, and then she'd go sit back with Hacka, and he got private
Wow.
to learn in that way. And he got married and
Did fine.
did well, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yes.
know, when you come to a place in the Bible like Judges,
Mhm.
it's a good time to stop, to pause, and even look at our book, the title, and remind yourself that this book that we look to, the Bible, is the unfolding word.
Yes.
And then the question on the back of the book is the Bible one story or many?
Mm.
What people tend to do when you get to Judges, they interpret the whole book by what they're reading, and that's why they end up being, I can't handle this, why would I think like this? So you have to keep in mind that it's an unfolding story that goes back to where we spent two or 3 or 4 lessons on Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, that covenant that God made with Adam. Don't do this, do this. If you do this, you'll live. If you don't do this, you'll die, and that kind of thing. And that's been the story since. And remember, we're gonna see this next week, because this is kind of leading us up to what the whole Mosaic economy was about. When they got to the Sinai, what did they say? Yes, we will do all that you have told us.
Yes.
And then Moses threw the blood on them, said, okay, the blood's on you, the covenant's being cut, because you're saying you're gonna keep it. Well, we've already noticed now, coming through those 40 years, all the period of the Judges, things were not very good.
No.
But what it's doing, again, the scriptures is a theological book, and it's unfolding toward the cross. Because here's the question, listen, this sums it up for really, at the end of the lesson we just finished, page 72, he asked this question, the author. The question Israel faced during the Judges cycle was whether they could obey. Could they be righteous enough to live in the land? And see, that's the question, and we get in this trap when you start looking at moralism and therapeutic ways of interpreting the faith, or even religious ways like, oh, look how beautiful we worship. We begin to think that we might be able to pull this off. We're pretty good. But the point of this is, no, we're no better than the people at Judges, at the end of Judges, standing before God. So it's all pointing to the cross. It's all pointing, in my opinion, to the doctrine of justification by grace alone, through faith alone, on account of Christ alone. Only He was righteous enough to enter that land. Only He was righteous enough to keep all that the law that you gave us. So that's what this book unfolds, always reminding us that Christ is the center.
Yeah.
And because it's so easy to get lost in the Judges and say, yikes.
Yeah. They must have been awful people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but not us.
Not us.